All right, so now we're going to get to talking about some of the battles and, more importantly, some of the people who led both as political and military leaders during World War II. So let's get into that. And I think we'll start with the who's who part. So these are the military and political leaders of both the Allies, that would be the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and a lot of other players, including Free Polish troops, Free French troops. China was an allied nation, versus the Axis powers, which would be primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, usually just FDR, was president of the United States through most of the war. He'd been in office since elected in 1933. He was, since he took office in 33, elected in 32. He was elected 4 times in 32, 36, 40, and 44, which is more times than any other U.S. president has been elected, and is more times than any president can now be elected because we amended the Constitution afterwards to prevent it. He did a good job overall. We won, after all, and you've seen how he worked to really get the United States industry and populace behind the war, and really did an excellent job of that. He's going to die of natural causes on April 12th, 1945, just a few weeks before the war ends in Europe. And Harry Truman will be the president at that point. So we're going to talk about four of the major American military leaders. There are literally hundreds of other people we could talk about. People like James Earl Rudder, who was from Texas. He went to A&M. He led a battalion of Rangers on D-Day. I mean, he's a great and really interesting guy. But we're just going to sort of focus on the top level people. The first person we're going to talk about briefly is Dwight Eisenhower, also known as Ike. He's an American general who would be chosen to be the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe. So he is the overall boss in the European theater of the war. His biggest trouble is politics. He has to balance out the British versus American interests while still keeping the minor players involved, dealing with the Soviets, and all of that. So he's got a big juggling match to do. One of his problems is the guy sitting to his right. So that's the top right. That is George Patton. He's a general, absolutely brilliant on the battlefield. This guy could inspire troops and fought like just mad. Nobody's business. Nobody could keep up with this guy. But he was politically disastrous. He was a prima donna. He liked to get his name in the papers and his face in the papers, and so he always had journalists following him around. Well, that meant that when he screwed up, it got on all the papers. And Patton had some serious reservations about our allies, the British, and very strong problems with our allies, the Soviets. In fact, immediately after Germany surrendered, Patton would, in front of journalists, say that we should rearm the Germans and turn and attack the Soviets, who were still technically our allies. Yeah, that didn't go over well. Chester Nimitz, bottom left. This guy is a Texas boy. He's from Fredericksburg, actually, which is why there is a big museum for the War of the Pacific in Fredericksburg, Texas, because that's where he's from, and it was his family's hotel. Anyway, he's going to be Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Pacific Theater. He is a Navy admiral. So why do we have a Navy commander in charge over in the Pacific rather than an Army guy? Well, because that's a Navy war. You can't get anywhere without ships over there. It's a great big ocean. And so we put the Navy in charge. The leading American general in the Pacific is the fellow to the right there with the corncob pipe. He's Douglas MacArthur, a.k.a. Dugout Doug. I'm not a fan. He was the leading American general in the Pacific. He highly resented being under the command of the Navy, even though for all practical reasons it's the only thing that made any kind of real sense, but he hated it. The reason I don't like him is pretty personal. Some of the orders he gave could have gotten my wife's grandfather killed when he was fighting in the Pacific, in the Philippines and such. If you get a chance, you can ask me about it more later.
You seated? I want you to remember that no bastard ever won war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. And then all this stuff you heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, big league ball players, the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. Now, an army is a team. It lives, eats, sleeps, fights as a team. This individuality stuff is a bunch of crap. The bilious bastards who wrote that stuff about individuality for the Saturday Evening Post don't know anything more about real battle than they do about fornicating. Now, we have the finest food and equipment, the best spirit, and the best men in the world. You know, by God, I actually pity those poor bastards we're going up against. By God, I do. We're not just going to shoot the bastards. We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun bastards by the bushel. Now, some of you boys, I know, are wondering whether or not you'll chicken out under fire. Don't worry about it. I can assure you that you will all do your duty. The Nazis are the enemy. Wade into them. Spill their blood. Shoot them in the belly. When you put your hand into a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you know what to do. Now, there's another thing I want you to remember. I don't want to get any messages saying that we are holding our position. We're not holding anything. Let the Hun do that. We are advancing constantly, and we're not interested in holding on to anything except the enemy. We're going to hold on to him by the nose, and we're going to kick him in the ass. We're going to kick the hell out of him all the time, and we're going to go through him like crap through a goose. Now, there's one thing that you men will be able to say when you get back home. And you may thank God for it. 30 years from now, when you're sitting around your fireside with your grandson on your knee, and he asks you, what did you do in the great World War II? You won't have to say, well, I shoveled shit in Louisiana. All right, now you sons of bitches, you know how I feel. I will be proud to lead you wonderful guys into battle anytime, anywhere. That's all.
Sir Winston Spencer Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain for King George VI and later Queen Elizabeth II, his daughter. He's going to be Prime Minister for most of the war for Britain. He takes over in 1940 when Neville Chamberlain, the guy who did the Munich conference, resigns. Churchill takes over, and he will be in power until the very end of the war. He is an absolutely tenacious man. He, to the point of utter stubbornness, and refuses to surrender, even in Britain's darkest hours. He's an incredible person. He is an artist. He painted. He's a writer and a historian. He was a military officer in his youth. He was a prisoner of war during the Boer War who escaped captivity and walked alone across a couple of hundred miles of African wilderness to escape. He's just an amazingly interesting individual, and half American, by the way. His mother was an American woman. Joseph Stalin. Stalin, we've talked about a little bit before when we talked about the rise of dictators in Europe. Stalin is the Soviet leader. His official title is Premier of the Soviet Union. He's been in office 1922 to 1952 until he dies. He is personally responsible for the deaths of millions of his own people. He starved them to death before the war. He purged his own military before the war in the 1930s because he was worried that some of them were disloyal to him. He was paranoid, schizophrenic. He had thousands of the top officers in the army shot or sent off to prisons in Siberia where they were worked to death, basically, just in time for World War II to come along, and a lot of the upper leaders not really have any idea what the heck they were doing. But hey, they were politically reliable at least. He was originally sort of allied with Hitler, with the whole invasion of Poland that we discussed earlier. But, of course, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, he obviously turned against Hitler. He never really liked Hitler. As a matter of fact, he hated Hitler. He despised Hitler. But this was all a matter of convenience as far as he was concerned. Then as the war continued, he would come to blame the United States and the United Kingdom for letting the Soviets bleed and basically be the wall upon which the Germans would smash themselves, but in the process killing millions of Soviets. And he's not entirely wrong. We did provide him with billions of dollars worth of equipment in order to keep them in the war, but that was because we would rather have seen Soviet soldiers die than American or British soldiers die. He was, as I said earlier, paranoid, ruthless, and murderous. He really did kill, 10 to 20 million of his own people, at least. Charles de Gaulle was the leader of Free France. When France falls, he was a French army officer. He would escape. He was one of the highest ranking ones they had, who escaped to Britain after the fall of France in June of 1940. He believed that he was massively important to the war effort. And honestly, if you ask a Frenchman these days, who won World War II, they're likely to say Charles de Gaulle. Matter of fact, I've been to a military museum in Paris, and you would think, having been there, that no one else fought the war against the Germans, just Charles de Gaulle himself, all alone. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the guy. He was an opportunist, I think. I don't think that he was particularly brilliant or anything. He got lucky, got out, and then used that to springboard a political career after the war. He does, however, have a great quote about why it's so hard to govern in France, because he said, "How could you govern a country that needs 246 varieties of cheese?" Also, he was not a big fan of the United States or our military. During the war, he even said, "You can be sure the Americans will commit all of the stupidities that they can think of, plus some that are beyond imagination." By the time the war is over, he basically is going to go in and take over France, the semi-dictator of France for a while, and would both join NATO and then leave it during the Cold War, which you'll understand a little bit more later on. A couple of other Allied military commanders that I think really bear mentioning, one for Britain, one for the Soviet Union. And they're the most famous. Again, there are dozens and dozens of other people we could talk about for both nations. But for Britain, we're going to discuss briefly Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who later becomes Lord El Alamein. His nickname is Monty. Like Patton, he was a prima donna. They fought in the same areas throughout the war, and they did not get along at all. As a matter of fact, one of the times Patton got in trouble was because he said some things about Monty, again, in front of his press corps, that were disparaging of the general who was a major hero to the British. And so that got him in trouble. He lost him a command and everything. Monty is a planner. He is big on having all of his ducks in a row. Everything all just so, plenty of supplies, everybody ready to go before he would make an attack. He was not a dashing and aggressive type who would just rush into the attack to shock the enemy and force them back. He was, however, victorious in North Africa. He was in charge of the landings in Sicily as they began to invade Italy, and then he was transferred over back to the UK to lead the actual landing part of the Normandy landings, and was the planner, architect, and motivator behind the failed Operation Market Garden, which we'll talk about more in a bit. For the Soviets, let's talk about Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Not Zuko, that's a guy in, that's the kind of neat prince kid from Avatar: The Last Airbender, although Uncle Iroh is my favorite character. Anyway, Zhukov had managed to survive Stalin's military purges in the 1930s by being basically very politically reliable. and rose to be in charge of the Soviet Union. He fought against Soviet Union's army, the Red Army is what it's called. He had fought against the Japanese in China as they invaded. There were some border skirmishes there between the Russians and the Japanese over Manchuria, and then came back to the West in early 1941, just before the German invasion. He's going to organize the defense of key cities like Leningrad and Moscow and Stalingrad. Stalingrad is a really important spot, and I don't spend a lot of time talking about it today because it doesn't involve the U.S. very much, but it was really super important because that's where the Soviets and the Germans just kept pouring men into this battle at this one city of Stalingrad. It's named for Stalin. Stalin's not going to let it fall. The Germans dadgum near take the place, and then the Soviets just keep pouring more men and more men and more men. And these guys, half of them don't even have a rifle, okay? That's how desperate the Soviets were at that point. They literally would pair up men and say, you and you take the rifle. When he falls, you pick up his rifle and keep going. Towards later in the war, he's going to be leading the attacks, which will finally smash the German army in the Soviet Union, push them out at the battles of Kursk and Operation Bagration, and will become the guy who invades Germany from the east. And as the Soviet troops get into Germany and the German-held lands, Zhukov is going to be in favor of reprisals. These are atrocities that were committed on the German civilians, and the reason that they did it was to pay the Germans back for the atrocities that the Germans had perpetrated against Soviet citizens when they invaded the Soviet Union. It doesn't really make a difference as far as all of the war, but it's basically just pretty awful. And now on to the bad guys, starting with the chief bad guy, Adolf Hitler. His title was Führer of the Third Reich. He was in power from 1933 to 1945. When he died, he was possibly the most evil man that ever lived. He was a paranoid schizophrenic, much like his enemy Stalin, but he was a mesmerizing public speaker. This man could sell snow to Eskimos. I mean, when he spoke, people listened. He could convince people of things. As the war went on, he got crazier and crazier. There were several attempts on his life by his own military because they were afraid he was going to drag Germany down into the dust with him, which is exactly what he was planning on doing. As far as Hitler was concerned, without him, there was no Germany, and so if he couldn't have it, he was just going to tear it all down. In the end, he will commit suicide to avoid capture by the Soviets. As the Soviets are coming into Berlin, the Western Allies permitted the Soviets to enter Berlin first. They get closer to the bunker underground where Hitler is hiding out, and he and his brand new wife, Eva Braun, they married the day before they killed themselves. They killed themselves on his 56th birthday, which was April 30th, 1945. Oh, one other thing. He had his dog shot beforehand so that they would be waiting for him in heaven when he got there. Poor things, I'm pretty sure, are still waiting and probably always will be. There's a few other really important Nazis I want to mention. Hermann Goering, bottom on the left. was second in power for most of the war. He had been a World War I ace. He was very popular with the people. He was outgoing and friendly and jovial and everything. He was also a morphine addict and a thief. He had art stolen from all over Europe and put into his personal collections. He was the head of the Luftwaffe. Technically, he was the Reichsmarschall, which means the head of all of the German military armed forces. But he had always pretty much been in charge of the Luftwaffe. That's the German Air Force. By the end of the war, he is captured and tried for war crimes at the Nuremberg War Crime Tribunals. He is sentenced to hang and would manage to commit suicide the day before his execution. In the middle is Heinrich Himmler, the only person who is possibly more evil than Hitler in Germany. Himmler is the guy who's in charge of the Gestapo, the secret police, Geheime Staatspolizei, which is the German long version of Gestapo, means secret state police. And he's in charge of the Schutzstaffel, the SS. These were the people who were basically the private army of the Nazi Party. They had two sections. They had the sort of civilian side, which is what ran the concentration camps and things, and the military side, which is known as the Waffen-SS, who were the guys who got all the best stuff and all the food and all of that, and just were really elite troops of the Germans. But technically, at least originally, you had to be pure Aryan blood and all of this sort of thing to be in it. As the war ends, he tries to escape. He is captured by the British. Everybody that ran west. They did not want to get caught by the Soviets because of what I told you earlier that the Soviets were doing. These reprisals against Germans. If the Soviets had got hold of any of these guys, they would have had a very painful but not very long life. Anyway, so Himmler gets captured by the British and ends up committing suicide in custody. He never goes on trial. The fellow to the right giving the speech is Joseph Goebbels. He's the Minister of Culture and Information, which means he was in charge of propaganda and book burning. He helped to promote the Nazi agenda. He was absolutely a true believer in Hitler. He and his wife Magda, they were in the bunker with Hitler, and when Hitler died, they poisoned their own children and then themselves, because as he left, basically he left a note saying that he didn't want his children to grow up in a world that didn't have Hitler in it. So yeah, scary. There was a lot of Nazism that was really, really scary stuff. I mean, there are films of kindergartners singing songs of praise to Hitler and stuff. I mean, we all hail Hitler, the immortal savior of our race. I mean, just scary, spooky, brainwashing stuff. It's a good thing they lost. This is Il Duce. I love that name. Il Duce. It means the leader, basically, much like the Führer. Führer just means leader in German. This is the leader in Italian. This is Benito Mussolini, the fascist prime minister of Italy. Technically, Italy was a kingdom. And you can see the national flag there, the flag of the Kingdom of Italy there. And then next to it, the black flag is the fascist party flag, which was much more commonly seen during the war years than the national flag, because Mussolini had tried to change over the flag to take off the royal symbol and there in the middle on the white and replace it with the fascist symbol, which is that axe with the rods on it. And everybody in Italy went no. And so he had to pull back from that. So he hated that. So anyway, Mussolini is basically Hitler's junior partner there in Europe. The Italians were not ready for a war. Their industry was not up to it. Their people weren't all that enthusiastic about it. He conscripted a lot of people. Um, and Mussolini has these glory dreams that just are not realistic in any way, shape, or form. They invade Albania, which is this little tiny country, and they almost lose. They go into Greece, and then and Yugoslavia, and they have to get the Germans to come help. They attack the British in North Africa, and then they have to get the Germans to help. And overall, for the war effort, that's a good thing, because all of those distractions put German soldiers in Greece and Yugoslavia and Africa instead of in the Soviet Union, where they might have actually won if they had had those troops. Anyway, so what ends up happening to him? Well, he's thrown out of power in 1943. He's deposed by his own government after the Allies successfully invade Sicily and then move on to invade the rest of Italy. He's actually captured by the Allies. The Germans break him out. They do a commando raid on the prison he's in, break him out, sneak him off, and bring him back to northern Italy, which is still in German hands. And by this point, Italy has switched sides in the war, and he's going to stay as a puppet, so-called legitimate government of Italy, although he wasn't. He was a puppet for the Germans. And eventually, as the war starts to wind to an end and the Germans start to surrender, he and his mistress try to flee to Switzerland. They're actually caught by communist partisans who kill them. Firing squad just shoot him down. They kind of mutilate his body and hang him and her. I don't know why they did it to her so much. I know why they did it to him. They hated him. But they hang him up by his feet publicly so that everyone can see that he's dead. Pretty gruesome, actually. Okay. This is Hirohito, who was the Emperor of Japan. He's now referred to as Emperor Showa. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but it's pretty close. After Japanese emperors die, they're only referred to by the name of their reign, which they always name their reigns when they become emperor. Anyway, he was Emperor of Japan. He took power in 1926. He was pretty young. I want to say he was about 22, 23 years old. Anyway, fairly young when he became emperor, and remained emperor until his death in 1989. And historians are pretty divided on this guy. During the war, he was portrayed like an evil dictator, much like Hitler and Mussolini were. After the war, he stays emperor. He doesn't lose his throne. He loses any power he had, but he remains the emperor because it's a very culturally significant thing. I mean, Japan still has an emperor. Only country in the world that still has an emperor is Japan. He doesn't have much of an empire, but he is the emperor. It's Hirohito's grandson is now the emperor of Japan. Anyway, so after the war, people started to think, well, maybe he was really just a puppet of a figurehead puppet of the army and the government ministers who were really running the show, just like they had back in the old days, up until the late 1800s, when a guy called the shogun used to run Japan in the emperor's name, but really for the shogun's benefit. And then after he died, that changed again, and historians became more critical as new documents came to light, and it makes him appear more involved than they kind of suspected before. Personally, I think he was really largely a figurehead, but also an opportunist. He had no problem I don't think, with what his armies were doing as far as conquering China and expanding the empire and his personal prestige, I think he actually dug that. I think he was very positive towards that. But how much control did he really have? I don't think he had just a whole lot. The army was really basically running the show in Japan at the time. I mean, if politicians spoke up, they got assassinated. They had accidents, the sort of accident where your house blows up and burns down and everybody in it is killed, and anybody that runs out gets shot by mysterious gunmen. Those kinds of accidents. So, I don't know. By the time he dies, he is the longest reigning monarch of Japan and the second longest reigning monarch that's ever been. And like I said earlier, his grandson is emperor now. His son, I don't think his son has died. I know his son abdicated. He's quite old and he retired. His grandson's only about 60 years old though, so he's got probably a good 20 or so more years as emperor. This, on the other hand, is General Hideki Tojo, the Prime Minister of Japan for most of the war from 1941 to 1944. He was a big advocate of a preventative war with the United States. He absolutely authorized and permitted and encouraged the use of things like chemical weapons against civilian populations in China. He is a war criminal. As a matter of fact, he's going to be tried and executed for war crimes in 1946. So he's the one that was absolutely pretty much running the show and saying, yes, we should do all of these pretty awful things, and had no problem with it. Part of it was cultural, part of it was personal, part of it was political. But yeah, not a terribly nice guy. Okay, so now what we're going to do is move into discussing the war itself and some of the fighting that took place in various places. And we're going to mostly focus on stuff that involves the U.S. because, well, after all, this is a U.S. history course. We'll start with the European theater because when Churchill and FDR first met in a conference, they agreed that really the big threat to the world was Hitler. That Japan was a threat, but that Hitler was closer to winning all of it. And if Hitler won, then it didn't matter about Japan. And if Hitler could be defeated, then Japan wouldn't be a problem. And so they had a Europe first plan. And so we'll talk about Europe first. Oddly enough, the first place we're going to talk about in the European theater isn't even in Europe. It's North Africa. And the war in North Africa took place pretty much within about 100 to 200 miles of the coast of the Mediterranean. And it's very much a war of maneuver. The Italians attacked. The Italians were in Libya, just to the west of Egypt, and they go after Egypt and the Suez Canal. Now, the British controlled Egypt, so the British stopped the Italians, and so they pushed the Italians back, and they almost pushed the Italians all the way out. And then the Italians call on their friends, their allies, their buddies, the Germans, and the Germans send a group of troops. It's a couple of panzer divisions and an infantry division eventually, called the Afrika Korps, the Deutsche Afrika Korps, DAK. And with those reinforcements, they start pushing the British back. And they, again, almost get to Cairo, which is on the Nile. It's the capital of Egypt. And if they take that, they basically beat the British in North Africa and cut Britain off from India, and that would be really in their oil, and that would be really bad. So the British almost get, but what happens is they're traveling all of these hundreds and thousands of miles across North Africa. They get to the end of their ability to keep their troops supplied. And so they push the British back, push the British back, push the British back, and then they start having trouble keeping gas for their tanks and shells for their guns and things. And so then the British counterattack and push the Germans and Italians back. And it just seesaws back and forth across North Africa a couple of times. Then in November of 1942, the U.S. will get involved in the first major involvement in the ground war. Now, we'd been fighting on the seas. Our Navy had been very busy, but it's taken almost a year for the U.S. to arm and equip an army of sufficient size to make any kind of a difference. And so we make landings. This is called Operation Torch, and you might need to know that. Operation Torch. It's the U.S. invasion of North Africa, and it's all the way over on the western coast of North Africa, in a place called French Morocco. And we come ashore, and it's actually fairly lightly defended. The French troops there mostly don't really want to fight us. They had fought with us against the Germans the last time, and they're not all that happy about being, sort of pushed around by the Germans. This is occupied French troops, Vichy French, and so they pretty much don't resist too much when the Americans land. As a matter of fact, a lot of them turn on the Germans with them and help the Americans rather than stopping them. However, we get there, and that's great, but then we go and we fight against the Africa Corps under the command of Erwin Rommel. Rommel is the guy in charge of the Africa Corps. And the first battle is a place called Kasserine Pass. Kasserine, Kasserine Pass. And we get stomped. And the reason we get stomped is because although we are well equipped and we have a lot of morale, we have zero freaking experience. And the Africa Corps has been fighting for years at this point. These guys are good. And Rommel was an excellent tank commander. He was brilliant, honestly. Probably the best general, certainly one of the best generals, but probably the best general that the Germans have. He actually ends up having to commit suicide because he's implicated in one of the plots against Hitler, and kind of a shame. But anyway, so he comes back and they change, because he whoops us so bad at Kasserine Pass, we change generals, and they put Patton in charge of this army. And Patton comes back, and now he's got, the British have pulled up, and now he's got what's left of the Italians and what's left of the Africa Corps stuck between Patton and his U.S. Army and Monty and his British Army, and they squeeze down on him. Okay, and so with that happening, the Axis troops, the Italians and the Germans, have to get out of Africa, and they basically abandon Africa in 1943. So after the main fighting in Africa is done, the next step is that we actually invade Sicily, that island at the toe of the Italian boot. And we take Sicily, and then we attempt to attack Italy. The idea is that Italy is the soft underbelly of Europe, as they put it. And it turns out it's not so soft. Not so much because of the Italians, but because of the terrain. It's a really long, skinny peninsula. It's got a lot of mountains in it. And even though the Italians surrender relatively quickly and switch sides, the Germans are using Italy as a series of defensive positions, and so it just grinds to the advance just basically grinds to a halt. Okay. Meanwhile, in December of 1943, the end of 43, there's a conference in Tehran, Iran, but with the big three. That's Churchill, Stalin, and FDR. Now, the Soviets had been fighting really hard since 1941. I mean, major battles, Stalingrad and the siege of Leningrad, which was still going on. And they basically, Stalin says, look, you have got to help. We're bleeding dry here. You have got to get involved in the war in Europe, or I might have to try to come to some sort of an agreement with Hitler. FDR and Churchill then agree to open a second front in France. They had always kind of figured that they would have to at this point, but they start the planning as a result of the Tehran Conference. And what comes of that planning is known as Operation Overlord. That's the name for the overall invasion of Normandy in France by the Allied powers. And it's going to be a massive undertaking. It is the largest amphibious assault that has ever taken place, probably the largest amphibious assault that ever will take place. Funnily enough, the Marine Corps, who is designed to do amphibious assaults, had nothing to do with the attack. At least not the U.S. Marine Corps. The British Marines did. So it's known as D-Day, and it takes place on June 6th, 1944. That is a date you will need to know. June 6, 1944 is when Operation Overlord begins. This is the invasion of Normandy in France by the Allies. Now, the Germans expected an attack into France from Britain. Okay, it's just like 20 miles over the ocean, over the English Channel, from Britain to France. It's a base that we've been building up forces on for years. The Germans have been watching us. They've got spies. They've got planes that they fly over and spy on us with. All of that. They know what's going on, or at least they think that they do. So they had fortified the whole coast of France. Spent millions and billions of dollars putting bunkers and tank traps and cannons and just all sorts of stuff, barbed wire and all sorts of things to make it really hard to attack. But thanks to some really sneaky moves by the Allies, the Germans think that we're going to attack at a place called Calais, not Normandy. And so most of their soldiers, most of their forces are over there to defend Calais. Now, they didn't strip Normandy, but they certainly didn't have it as heavily stacked up as they would have had they known that it was coming to Normandy. One of the ways that they did that was by making the Germans think Patton was going to lead it. The Germans were most scared of Patton. They thought he was the Allies' best general. And was therefore a shoo-in to be the leader of the invasion of France. Well, at the time, unfortunately for Patton, he was on the outs politically. And so what they did was they created a fake army command and put Patton in charge of it. And they totally faked out the Germans. They even went so far as to take a set of plans, put them on a dead body, a fellow who had died of pneumonia, and made it look like he was a British courier, dumped him off the coast of Spain. His body washed in. The Spanish found him in his plans. They handed them over to the Germans because they were very buddy-buddy with the Germans, even though they were technically neutral. We talked about that before. And so the Germans get these plans saying the attack is coming at Calais and it's going to be led by Patton. And so they're watching Patton and reinforcing Calais. And while they're doing that, we attack at Normandy. Americans will land at 2 of the 5 beaches called Utah and Omaha. They each had their own little code names. We also parachuted 2 divisions of airborne behind enemy lines. That picture there is of Eisenhower addressing soldiers of the 101st Airborne. It's one of our 2 airborne divisions that we had at the time. They will jump into France the night before, praying that the landings go well, because if they don't, they're all dead. that's the long and the short of it. Those guys were crazy brave. My best friend's granddaddy was in the 82nd Airborne, who also jumped that night. Ended up landing near a place called Saint-Mère-Église, which is pretty famous. Anyway, there were heavy casualties on D-Day, especially on Omaha Beach. Approximately 10,000 Allied casualties overall, about a quarter of them on Omaha with American troops. And that was because of a lot of different things. But one of the big things was that there was a lot of confusion and as to where each of the groups was supposed to land, and they got all mixed up, and it was kind of a nightmare. Here is a map showing Operation Overlord, and if you look to the left of the map, you have the U.S. forces landing at Utah and Omaha beaches, and then to the right, you've got the British Second Army, which is British 30 Corps, Canadian Infantry, British Infantry, and the British Airborne Division dropping back there as well. And so, and also showing where the 82nd and 101st dropped behind the lines near Carentan and Saint-Mère-Église. Anyway, that's basically where they came in. And Paris would be, if you look at the little inset map, it shows where Paris is and Britain and all of that. So you can see kind of where it is. The next slide has a clip from Saving Private Ryan. It's about 7 minutes long. It is pretty violent. You can skip ahead if you like. It's not necessary, but I include it because it is the most accurate filmed depiction of what it was like to land that day. And so I've cut most of the violent, most of the really gory stuff out, and most of the language and stuff out. But if you don't want to see it, just skip ahead about 7 minutes, and you will move on to the next slide. You won't miss anything that's going to be tested, but it is it's a really good film adaptation of what really happened.
shore. We got no DD tanks on the beach. Dog 1 is not open. This is all that's made it.
Get it pretty bad, so there's bound to be more of them.
Not enough. It's not enough.
Dog 1 exit. It's got to be that cut on the right, or is it the one on the left?
No. Deerville is to the west of us. This is Dog 1.
They're killing us!
Bangalores! Bring up some Bangalores!
Engineer coming! Grenades! Grenades! Give me the grenades! Get him over here!
Bangalore's on the line!
Heads up! Players coming your way! Come on! Jackson, here, sir! Right back.
Open. Ryman, Mellis, let's get into the war. Grab some cover and put some fire on that crew.
Yes,
Davis, DiBernardo, Young, Bolt, get ready. Hey, next.
Just hand a blindfold, yeah.
All we can do here is die. Covering fire! Go, go, go! Come on, come on, come on.
Go! God damn it!
Jackson. You see that impact crater?
Yes, sir.
That should give you complete defilade from that machine gun position. Get in there and give me some fire discipline. Wait for my command. You were my mother.
All my strength, hasty to help me.
Dog 1 exit! Right here! Our business!
All right, Operation Market Garden. This is going to take place in September of 1944. We have basically gotten France back, and we're going across the northern part of Europe, and we're looking at the Netherlands. That's Holland, basically, and which is right next to Germany. And so we've got to cross this fairly big river called the Rhine to get from the Netherlands into Germany. And there's some bridges across it that we need to be in control of in order to be able to cross the Rhine. And so it takes a big heavy bridge to put tanks across it. So that's the kind of bridge we're looking for. And the Germans are trying to keep us from getting those because they don't want us to be able to drive into Germany. Anyway, so Monty comes up with this really complicated plan that everything has to go just right for it to work. And of course, it doesn't. You never have everything go just right. And so he has this overly complicated plan to capture these three key bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. These are three towns in the Netherlands and Belgium. And it's going to use 3 divisions of airborne forces and a couple of divisions of armor and infantry in what's known as 30 Corps. It's a big armored column. And the biggest problem is they have to rush all of these soldiers, not the ones that they drop by plane, but all of these other soldiers up one narrow road. one road. And every time something happens, it stops the entire column. And so they get slowed down so much that they can't possibly get to reinforce the paratroopers. Okay, they do catch up to the 82nd and 101st, both of the U.S. divisions, but the British 1st Para Division, which has the last of the bridges, the third bridge at Arnhem, they can't get it. And it's not even their fault. They fought magnificently and held out for days longer than they were supposed to have. Airborne forces don't carry a lot of heavy equipment with them because they're jumping out of planes. And so they really can't bring much heavy, so they don't have like a lot of cannons and stuff. Well, that's kind of what you need to stop a tank. They have no tanks. And so when the Germans start bringing tanks up, that's when they beat the British there. This is the largest air assault in history. It's also one of the last. There's never going to be another major air assault, because if you tried to do this now, all these poor sons of guns that just get shot out of the sky, it would be ugly. The last major battle of the European theater is going to take place in December of 1944. This is basically Hitler's last gamble. He wants to defeat the Allies in the West. His idea is if we push them back far enough, maybe we can convince them to just end the war, with everything going back to kind of the way it was before the war. And we'll give back France and Belgium and the Netherlands and all like that. We'll be back into Germany, and but because he's worried about the Soviets, and he needs to be. So he's hoping that if he can get the Western Allies to quit, he can then turn all of his forces against the Soviets and maybe still pull out a win over the Soviets. He waits until the weather is bad. It's right around Christmas. It's incredibly cold. There's a bunch of snow. There's a lot of overcast skies and things. So our air forces can't bomb them because we can't see them. So our airplanes have to stay on the ground. And so we can't just pick off their tanks and stuff from the air like we had been doing. We've basically destroyed the Luftwaffe. It's basically out of the way. So whenever the skies are clear, we own whatever we can see. But the skies weren't clear. Okay, the Germans push in, and you can see the bulge there in this little map where the German lines suddenly bulge in towards Belgium. They surround the 101st Airborne again at a place called Bastogne, calling them to surrender, and the commander of the 101st at the time tells them nuts, as in, no, we're not gonna. You're nuts if you think we're gonna. Anyway, and a rapid counterattack by Patton's Third Army coming up from the south down there threatens the German flank. The Germans have to retreat. They're also running out of fuel. They don't really have much gas left. One of their big objectives was to capture the American fuel supplies, or Allied fuel supplies, because Germany is very low on fuel at this point. And really, when this fails, this was a all or nothing kind of thing. Hitler had put everything he had left into it. When it fails, he goes completely around the freaking bend, and it's all over for Germany. And not long afterwards, there'll be another conference of the Big Three. FDR is very ill at this. This is February of 45. This is the last time they'll meet. And what they met to do was to determine the balance of power in post-war Europe. They know there's no way that the Germans are going to win at this point. They know that it's going to be a win for the Allies, and so they start talking about how they're going to divvy up Europe and how they're going to restore the balance of power and everything. And FDR, who had agreed with Churchill way back in the Atlantic Charter to do things one way, sells out to the Soviets at this point. He basically says, well, what the Soviets grab will kind of let them hold. And that's a total betrayal of Churchill. Not FDR's finest moment. VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, is officially May 8th, 1945. Germany will surrender unconditionally, but neither Hitler nor FDR are alive to see it happen. Roosevelt had died on April 12th, like I said earlier, of natural causes, and Hitler died just about a week before that by suicide. He took poison and shot himself at the same time. He wanted to make doubly sure. His body was then burned outside of his bunker to keep it from being paraded around by the Soviets. It is not true that he escaped. That is a myth. He did not. He died. They destroyed his body. He did not escape to Argentina or Brazil. There are no Hitler clones. He's not at a secret Antarctic base. They didn't go to the moon and hide on the dark side. Yes, that is a theory. None of that happened. He died. The Nazis had long been using Jews and communists and other undesirable types, as they saw it, as scapegoats for all of the problems of not only Germany, but Europe and the rest of the world. At some point in 1941, Hitler and his top advisors had decided that the solution to this so-called problem was to kill every Jew. And in January of 1942, many of the leaders of Germany met at a conference in a place called Wannsee, and so it's called the Wannsee Conference, to work out the details of how all of this would happen. They estimated that 11 million Jews would fall underneath this plan, including Jews not in areas controlled by the Germans at the time. So Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question, which was whether or not there should be Jewish people in Europe, or whether it should be, as the Nazis called it, Judenfrei, which means Jew-free, was to work them to death if they were physically healthy, and if they weren't, to simply kill them. The result of this is that 6 million Jews were murdered. 2.7 million non-Jewish Poles were murdered. About 4 million other people, Russians, POWs, the handicapped, homosexuals, political dissidents, anyone who spoke out against the Nazis or Hitler or the Holocaust or any of it, were murdered. As things had gotten worse and worse, Jews attempted to escape Germany, and some of them tried to get to the United States. But at the time, we had very strict quota laws as far as how many people from each country could come to the United States per year. We still do. They're not as strict as they used to be. In 1939, there was a German ship with 1,000 Jewish refugees expected to go to the United States. They went to Cuba first, and were supposed to turn after Cuba and go to the United States. It was all supposed to have been cleared and figured out. The U.S. refused to allow them to enter. The Cubans eventually sent them back to Germany, and they were killed. From 1939 to 1941, approximately 200,000 European Jews made it to the United States. Only 21,000 Jewish refugees from any part of Europe were allowed to enter the U.S. during the war. This is a really kind of emotional topic for me personally. I have a very good friend of mine who, when I grew up, we were very close. He's Jewish. His grandparents who lived with him were Holocaust survivors. And anyway, so it comes very close to me. That's why I don't talk about it too much. It's a topic you can't skip. You simply can't. The Jewish people were put on trains, had all of their belongings taken from them, and sent off to concentration camps and later to what we call death camps. Concentration camp was like a really terrible prison. A death camp was a murder factory. That's what they were for. Most famous of them is probably Auschwitz. That's all I can say about this. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Pacific Theater, and we're not going to spend as much time on this as it really probably deserves, simply because we're running kind of long on time. But it's a mostly, not solely, but mostly American war against the Japanese, at least in the Pacific. There is, over in Southeast Asia, there's quite a bit of fighting with the British versus the Japanese. And the Chinese, of course, are still fighting the Japanese in China, and that was a major fight, which certainly helped the U.S. By tying down hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers in fighting in China. So after the disaster at Pearl Harbor, the Allies went on the defensive for several months. We had to rebuild our strength. The Japanese had, at the same time, snatched up several U.S. controlled islands, also British and Dutch controlled islands. They invaded French Indochina, which is Vietnam now. They went over into Burma in Southeast Asia. They attacked Australia. We were going to use Australia as a base to go against the Japanese because it's relatively close, and it would have been very difficult for the Japanese to take it away. Much like Britain was a launching point for the attack into France. Anyway, so that was kind of what was going on for that first part. So we have to rebuild our strength. We have to build ships. We have to train up our Marines. We have to get Army put together and everything. We have a new guy in charge in the Pacific. That's going to be Nimitz. And he comes up with a plan known as island hopping. And what this strategy is to move towards the Japanese home islands by going up these peripheral island chains that sort of lead towards it. And we would bypass heavily defended islands whenever it was possible. We just skip over them, because if we controlled the islands kind of around them, then they would be surrounded and they wouldn't be able to get supplies, and eventually they'd have to surrender. And that does happen somewhat. It's not so much that they surrender, it's that eventually they take off. They just have to pull out with a lot of losses. We are going to talk about 4 battles here real quick. because they're kind of important in various ways. And this is the order in which they take place. The Battle of Coral Sea, which was the first naval battle fought only by carrier-borne aircraft. All of the fighting that took place, this is near Australia. This is how we stopped them from taking over Australia, or really threatening to take Australia, is at the Battle of Coral Sea. And the ships never see each other. At no point do the ships see each other. They're so far apart. All of the fighting is done by airplanes launched off the carriers. Okay? And so that's the first time that's ever happened. It's important because it shows how vital aircraft carriers are going to be to the new kind of fighting wars. The Battle of Midway, which is the turning point in the Pacific War. We sneak in an ambush, basically. We were reading Japanese codes. We had broken some of their codes, and so we figured out, based on that, where they were going to attack next. And we made sure that they didn't know that we knew. And in so doing, it let us basically jump them. And we managed to sink 4 Japanese carriers, their 4 biggest carriers. And while the loss of the ships was bad for them, even worse was the loss of all of the planes and pilots, because every one of those planes went into the water. They didn't have any place they could land. And so they lost almost all of their pilots and a heck of a lot of planes in the Battle of Midway. And from that point on, they're in real trouble because they can't catch up to us again. Okay, so that's why it's a big turning point of the war. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is important because it's the first time the Japanese will use intentional kamikaze attacks. Now, kamikaze means divine wind, and it comes from an old Japanese legend. But in the modern sense, it's when you intentionally crash your plane into a ship or some other target to blow it up. And while throughout the war, both sides, when you were trying to attack the enemy, if you'd got all shot up and you knew you weren't going to make it back, a lot of times they would try to crash their plane. You would try to crash your plane into the enemy and do some damage as you went. But at Leyte Gulf, they did it 100% on purpose. They flew planning on not coming back, and it became a very common tactic for the rest of the war. The Battle of Iwo Jima was a major battle. Iwo Jima is a island that was near enough to Japan and big enough to put an airstrip on, that if we took it, we would then have an airfield that we could bomb Japan directly from with the big planes. Carriers can't carry really big planes. They're just too small. They're not long enough. Anyway. So for the really big bombers, you needed a long runway, and that meant having an island. And so we fight for the island of Iwo Jima. It was a Japanese island. It was extremely heavily defended. Very few Japanese of the tens of thousands of Japanese on the island. I think less than 200 were captured alive. It's very bloody. A third of all the Marines killed in the whole war died on Iwo Jima.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
And the probably the most famous photo of the whole war was taken there on top of the volcano that formed the island, Mount Suribachi. When we captured most of the island, we raised a U.S. flag at the top of Mount Suribachi, and they took a picture of it. And there it is. It's a very famous photo. I'm sure you've seen it before. Okay. The atomic bomb. As we close in on Japan, the plan to invade the Japanese home islands begins because the Japanese are showing no signs of being willing to surrender. And to be honest, they weren't willing to surrender. They were they were planning on holding out to the last, and they were giving grandmothers bamboo spears to hide. And when an American or British soldier came by, they were expected to snatch up their little bamboo spear and stab the invading soldier and die for the emperor and take one of them with us. The idea was that invading Japan would probably cost 1 million lives. And part of that is why the new president, Harry Truman, agreed to use a new weapon that he had just found out about a few months before, called the atomic bomb, to force Japan to surrender without having an invasion. Now, the Manhattan Project was the secret project to build the atomic bomb. It had cost $2 billion. Now, that's in their terms. Nowadays, you're talking a few $100 billion. The military commander of it was a man by the name of Leslie Groves. He started as a colonel, he ended as a general. The scientific leader was a man named J. Robert Oppenheimer, but there were a lot of other famous physicists involved, including a fellow by the name of Enrico Fermi and another one by the name of Einstein. So, a few guys kind of important. Anyway, Oppenheimer, as scientific leader, he actually later on regretted his part in developing the bomb. He thought he was doing something good to help, end wars and show how dangerous this could be. And then when he saw it tested, he kind of freaked out a little bit and quoted some ancient Hindu scripture. We actually had built 3 bombs and used all 3 of them. The first one we used on July 16th of 1945 at the Trinity site. It's called the Trinity Test in New Mexico. Then we dropped 2 of them on Japan. On August 6th of 1945, Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, an American B-29 bomber, would drop 1 bomb over the city of Hiroshima. It was nicknamed Little Boy. When it went off, it killed 66,000 people in a flash of an eye. 3 days later, they dropped another one on August 9th, 1945, over the city of Nagasaki. This one's nickname was Fat Man. It's a different kind of bomb, had a different shape. It was big and round, and that's why they called it Fat Man. Killed 39,000. These were military targets, contrary to public opinion or a commonly held belief. They were absolutely military targets. They weren't just civilian targets. Not that we had problems bombing civilians either, but these were militarily chosen targets. And after the second bombing, the Japanese were convinced to surrender. Truman was bluffing that we had more bombs ready to drop. And he did that for 2 reasons. One was to convince the Japanese to quit. The second reason he was bluffing about how many bombs we had actually has to do with the Soviet Union. The Soviets had finally gotten into the war against Japan now that Germany was defeated, and they were gobbling up parts of Korea. And we wanted them to stop moving south. And so we wanted to make them think that we had more bombs and that they wouldn't want to risk a war with us because they didn't have the bomb. We were the only ones that did. We'll get into that more when we talk about the Cold War. Convinced by the destruction of the 2 bombs, the Japanese will finally surrender. And on September 2nd, 1945, we celebrate VJ Day. And in Times Square, New York, when they announced it, this sailor grabbed this nurse. They did not know one another. He plants a big kiss on her, and there happened to be a Time magazine photographer there, snapped this picture. Again, another really famous picture of the time. The official surrender documents will be signed aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor a little bit later, towards the end of the month. The Missouri is currently docked in Pearl Harbor permanently, and she has the spot where the documents were signed marked on the deck. It's really neat. If you ever get to Hawaii, you should definitely go to Pearl Harbor and see that, and see the Arizona Monument, and take that tour. So what was the costs of this war? Well, the worst one is, of course, the human lives. It was incredibly expensive in terms of money as well, and it had some long-lasting effects, most of which we'll discuss when we talk about the Cold War. At least 50 million people died as a direct result of the war. We don't know how many exactly, and we never will. Neither the Russians nor the Chinese nor the Japanese kept what you would call meticulous records of their losses or who they killed. Estimates range that it went as high as 85 million people. Most of the losses by far were on the Allied side, especially the Soviets and the Chinese. The U.S. lost about 420,000 people, which is a lot, but it's only about 1/3% of our population before the war started. The Soviets lost about 24 million people, and then some, at least 24 million. About 14% of their pre-war population. That's about 1 in 7. The U.S. spent more than $4 trillion in 2011 money. That would be more now. The effort and expense bankrupted the British Empire, which would begin to collapse in the decades following. And our wartime alliances, where the Western Allies teamed up with the Soviet Union, fell apart. That's no big surprise. We really didn't like the Soviet Union. They didn't like us. We just disliked Hitler more. But the Cold War between the East and the West will begin, and that conflict will last for 40 years. Here's a chart that does a really good job of showing you in a graphic form what we're talking about. The red is military deaths in millions. The orange is civilian deaths in millions. Soviet Union lost the most, somewhere around 24 million. China lost the next most at about 20 million. But look at the difference between the length of the red line and the orange line for China. Most of the Chinese that died, about 16 million of them, were civilians. They were civilians. Poland lost almost 18%, a little over 18% of their pre-war population. That's about 1 in 5. Now look down towards the bottom, towards the middle of that Allied forces, and you see United States. We have virtually no orange because we lost virtually no civilians. We did lose a few thousand, but compared to all of this, nothing. Our losses in this war were light compared to everyone else. 58% of the people that died were Allied civilians. More than half were Allied civilians. That statistic right there just tells you how bad the war was, how ugly and terrible the people that were in charge in Germany and Japan and Italy and the other Axis countries were, how little they cared about human life. So it's a very good thing that the good guys, relatively speaking, won this war. And that's going to do it for this set and this unit. So the next thing up is going to be your exam number 4, which is going to open up Wednesday morning. Because this is going up so late, I'm going to give you an extra day to work on it. I was going to close it on Friday. Now I'm going to close it on Saturday at 11:59 p.m. So at the end of the day on Saturday. After that, you'll need to start reading chapter 24 for next week. And if you have any questions, please drop into the Discord on Wednesday or Thursday. I can't answer questions about the test on Thursday because the test will be open. But we can, you can, maybe I'll postpone the Wednesday start until after I'm offline so that you can ask questions before the test on Wednesday. Matter of fact, I think I'm going to do that. So we'll talk to you then. Goodbye.